Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Professor Kenny, Professor Farooq Musa, YB Zaril, Dr. Zulkifli, friends. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Salam Sujatra, peace be with you. I'd like to begin by thanking the organizers, the hosts, for this very kind invitation, especially my friend, Dr. Farooq. In my commentary, I shall concentrate on 5 interrelated points, partly as a response to Professor Kenny, but also as a way of furthering the dialogue. Number 1, my starting point is not what is conventionally called the Middle East. I don't use that term at all, because the use of that term itself is a reflection of a certain mindset. Why is it the Middle East? A term that was coined in the middle of the 19th century in London as part of British colonialism. They were looking at the world and they said, well, this is the Middle East for us. That Middle East is not my Middle East. Geographically, it's more accurate to call it West Asia and North Africa. So I use the term, which is also used in international politics, WANA, West Asia and North Africa. That's the region we're talking about. But that's not my starting point as far as this discussion is concerned. For me, if you want to look at contemporary religious extremism and geopolitics, the starting point is Afghanistan. It's not West Asia, it's Afghanistan. Afghanistan brings to the fore various dimensions of what we are really looking at. In Afghanistan, and I'm talking of Afghanistan 1979, you had a government which was stable in many ways, and if you look at that government and its predecessor governments, in terms of how we understand statehood and governance, those governments in Afghanistan were actually quite progressive. Look at the situation of women at that time. Look at the state of the economy. But because of certain internal problems at that time, and also because of the larger geopolitics of the region, there was an attempt to destabilize the situation. Religious elements were manipulated as revealed in various writings, including Brzezinski's Grand Chessboard, the manipulation of the internal dynamics of the situation in Afghanistan. And this was perhaps the first time after the Second World War that there was a concerted, systematic, organized attempt to manipulate Islam in order to achieve larger geopolitical aims. And that manipulation came from the West, of various actors and forces in Afghanistan. There was an attempt to create a network. That jihadist network that emerged could never have emerged in that form without the assistance of the CIA and the Pakistani ISI, who played a major role in creating that huge network. You had people from Malaysia and Indonesia, from all over the world, who were part of that network in order to defeat the Soviet Union. Brzezinski was to write later that we wanted Afghanistan to become the Soviet Union's Vietnam. And this is what happened. Mass global mobilization of Muslims who, for good reasons, were unhappy with what had happened in Afghanistan. There was an invasion and occupation of a Muslim land. They felt that they had to liberate an occupied land. It was a Quranic imperative. But at the same time, they were used and manipulated by this major superpower, which had its own agenda. So if you look at Afghanistan, you have the geopolitical dimension and US's agenda. You had internal power politics, and you had the emergence of the Wahhabi ideology as a force in both domestic and international politics. Al-Qaeda linked to, well, a major Saudi Arabian actor, if you like, and other Arabs who were part of Al-Qaeda, fighting in Afghanistan. The Afghan adventure is over, but the infrastructure is still there, and it had to find a role for itself. So there were incidents here and there involving the so-called jihadists. And I suspect, as others have written about this, people like Mahmoud Mamdani and so on, that there was again the Western hand manipulating these groups. And you had one incident after another. I mean, we know of the series of incidents, the basement in the World Trade Center, 1993. You had, of course, what happened in Eden, East Africa. And then, of course, the culmination of it all was 9/11. 9/11 is linked to the war on terror, which is the second point that I want to make here. That you have Afghanistan, you have the war on terror. And it's very important to look at the war on terror. The war on terror was a conscious attempt by the centers of power in the West to create an enemy in the post-Cold War scenario. You needed an enemy in order to maintain your hegemony, because you cannot perpetuate your hegemony without an enemy. You had to perpetuate a certain military infrastructure. You had to ensure that certain interests would be perpetuated. To do that, you needed an enemy. And this fighting force that emerged from Afghanistan fitted the bill. They were capable of fighting. They were willing to fight. As my late friend Ali Mazrui used to say, the thing about the Afghanis is that they're such good fighters that they can never stop fighting. So there it is. They made use of that, manipulated it, which is why I think the whole truth about 9/11 is really not known. What was really behind 9/11, who were the actors, what were the motives, and all the rest of it. But 9/11 was convenient in order to launch this war on terror. So if you look at what had happened after 9/11, you had, of course, Afghanistan as the immediate reaction to 9/11. And then, of course, you had Bali, you had Madrid, you had London. So you can see the pattern. And in every instance, the forces connected with Afghanistan, Al-Qaeda and the others, were supposed to have been involved in one way or another. Like in the case of July 2006 in London, they were supposed to have been involved, these elements, from both the testimonies of some of those individuals who had helped those guys who were part of that episode, and also from intelligence reports. So here you have the situation, the war on terror, an attempt to actually target Islam instead of saying war on Islamic terror, because it's not politically correct to say that. So you say war on terror, but basically it was directed at Islam. And that brings me to a third point that I want to make, that the war on terror, driven by Western imperial interests, a hegemonic agenda, it had a very important actor whose role at that time and even now has remained somewhat concealed and camouflaged. And what is that actor? And that actor is Israel and its Zionism. You just look at a number of statements made by major Israeli leaders, Ariel Sharon, for instance. As soon as 9/11 happened, what the man said was, now we must make that connection between the terrorism in Palestine, the terrorism associated with Palestinian freedom fighters. We must make that connection with global terrorism. And this has been the game all along, to establish the so-called link, which is why West Asia then became the theater, because it served, number one, Israel's own interests, oil, and of course the larger strategic interests of Western hegemony. Mind you, West Asia is the only spot on Earth where 3 continents meet. You look at the waterways, very, very strategic. And again, it is a coincidence that 8 of the 10 major strategic routes in the world, Muslim majority countries, are the littoral states. So you have both oil and you have the situation of Muslim states as littoral states, and this attempt to control and dominate. Which is why US leaders at that time, just before the beginning of the Iraq War, they presented it as an attempt to shape a new Middle East, the phrase which Condoleezza Rice used a number of times, shaping a new Middle East. Iraq becomes a major factor in this. If you look at it in strategic terms, Iraq was very important. If you look at oil, Iraq was very important. If you look at the interests of Israel, Iraq was very important, because whatever one may say about Saddam Hussein, he was a consistent defender of Palestinian rights. The families of Palestinian martyrs, a huge number of them were looked after by Iraqi oil. So Saddam had to be eliminated. Iraqi oil had to be controlled. It was, at one point, the second biggest oil exporter within OPEC. And for strategic reasons, of course, Iraq was vital. And so the conquest of Iraq. An academic, this is one of the sad things about academics, that sometimes academics play very foolish roles in trying to justify things which in the end lead to huge tragedies. It is a pity that American policymakers had so much faith, according to later analysis, in what Fuad Ajami told them about Iraq and about what Iraq would mean for US imperial interests. Fuad Ajami, I think you know Jeff, he was Lebanese, an American, a respected academic in some circles. And he was the guy who pushed very hard for the conquest of Iraq, because he said Iraq is going to become what Japan has become to the United States of America. In West Asia, Iraq would be the equivalent of Japan. You conquer, you occupy, you'll be able to transform Iraq, and then you will have a very stable anchor in that part of the world. But this turned out to be the greatest disaster of the 21st century, the conquest of Iraq. To this day, you look at what is happening in Iraq, the instability, the mess, the tragedy, the suffering of the people. This is why whenever I read about people being beheaded and families in the West who feel the pain of things like this, I ask myself, why is it people are not shedding tears for what is happening to Iraqi babies to this day? If in a family of 5, 4 of your babies are born deformed, can you imagine the pain and the suffering that that family would go through it, all because of your depleted uranium? And this is well documented. Up to this day, this continues to happen. In Fallujah, in a number of other cities, this is the consequence of the conquest of Iraq. So this is the other dimension that I want to highlight, that this attempt to reshape West Asia on the basis of this hegemonic agenda has been a disaster, a total disaster. And we have to link it with the fourth point I want to make very quickly, the Arab uprisings. And I don't want to call it the spring, because I don't think that's the right word to use. It gives you a sort of seasonal notion of change, spring. Yeah? But basically the Arab uprisings, they are linked to what had happened in Iraq, without any doubt at all. Because I think those who thought they could reshape the map of West Asia, they thought that the Arab uprisings would also help them to reshape the map of West Asia. The uprisings, to some extent, were a product of those societies, especially in the case of Tunisia and Egypt, where I think they were genuine to a great extent. But the uprisings were also manipulated. We saw it in Egypt. As soon as it happened, the manipulation started. They wanted a certain pattern of power to emerge. It didn't work out, which is why they had people like Umar Sulaiman and others hoping that he could take over from Mubarak. It just didn't work out. But the manipulations have continued. Tunisia, less interest in it because if you look at Tunisia's location, it is not strategically important to Israel. But Egypt is, Jordan is, Syria is, Lebanon is. And you will find that wherever you find that Israel's interests are paramount, chaos follows in all the countries which have been part of the so-called Arab uprising. My response to Farid Zakaria when he talked about Tunisia, Jeff, about how stable it is and so on, there are two important points about Tunisia that many of these analysts very conveniently ignore. One of them is that Israel has no direct interest in Tunisia. And Israel's role in West Asia is critical in order to understand the turmoil in West Asia. So don't ignore Israel. Don't try to sort of downplay Israel's role. Israel is at the forefront of the mess that is taking place. Israel will always try to determine who should be in power in Cairo. And they've done that for quite a long while. Israel had a hand in the overthrow of the Morsi regime. And if you look at Israel's role in Syria, they had bombed various parts of Syria 8 times so far since 2011. The Golan Heights is under Israeli control. The Golan Heights supplies 1/3 of Israel's water. So are they going to leave these places alone? Look at Lebanon. They regard Lebanon as its strategic front, the Litani River, as vital to Israel's strategic interests. Jordan, they see it as part of the solution that they want eventually as far as Palestine is concerned. So Israel's role is very, very critical, and that has begun to unfold. And I think Israel has a very big interest in ensuring, and here we're talking about religious violence and so on, in trying to portray the Palestinian struggle, the struggle of other Arabs, whether they're Lebanese or Syrians or other Arabs. They have a stake in portraying these struggles as terrorist. And they'll do it everywhere. They'll do it in Paris to give the impression that this is what it's all about. And you see, if you look at what's happened in France and in Sweden to some extent, it has also served another of Israel's goals. You create that mess and then you tell the French Jews, migrate, come to Israel. You can't live in France anymore. You can't live in Sweden anymore because these places, they're not safe for you. They're not hospitable anymore. So there are other interests at play, and we must keep that in mind. So this is the point that one wants to make, that if you look at West Asia today and the mess that it is in, it is because of some of these factors. Number one, the centers of power in the West, the United States, and not just the United States, France, Britain, these two in particular, they want a particular type of West Asia for the reasons that I had outlined earlier, because of oil, because of its strategic location, and most of all because of Israel. Now, Israel itself, this is the second actor, they want a particular type of West Asia where everyone is under their thumb. Only then do they feel secure. The Israeli notion of security is really bizarre. Their notion of security is that they must be in a neighborhood where everyone else is totally emasculated, and then they will feel secure. Which is why they would create this hell of a great myth about Iran's nuclear weapons. And they have created this myth about enemies all around them, and they tell lies. Netanyahu is undoubtedly the greatest liar that politics has seen. I don't think he can do anything to us. We are saying this here in Malaysia, at least for the time being. But this is the situation. You have people who have been operating this way. So it is the centers of power in the West, it is Israel, it is the regional powers outside Israel, in the region. Saudi Arabia has a major stake and is playing its game. Iran, of course, is also wanting to entrench and expand its influence. And you have got Egypt, which cannot be ignored. It is a major actor. So you have these regional actors. There's Turkey, Turkey, and it's not just modern Turkey, it's also Turkey which has got certain visions of its old Ottoman Empire, and is also playing its game in the region. So you've got these regional actors. You've got the Sunni-Shia divide, which is yet another factor that we have to take into account, which again is something that has been exploited, and I think as YB Zahrail pointed out earlier, it is something that has been exploited to serve other interests. I very often make this point about the Sunni-Shia conflict. Isn't it amazing that when the Shah of Iran was in charge of Iran, he was also Shia. The Saudi ruling elite, the ruling house, had no problems with the Shah of Iran. Suddenly it became a problem after the 1979 Islamic Revolution. And then, of course, the Shia issue and about, Shias and all the rest of it. But it is basically the power play that we are witnessing here. And we have to understand that. But the Sunni-Shia thing is exploited. Unfortunately, a lot of Muslims in this country have also taken the bait. And it's partly because of some of the religious elites in this country who are part of the establishment, who have been doing this, manipulating Sunni-Shia feelings. And suddenly all of them have become very innocent. And they say, oh, all these things are happening, but they contributed to it in building up this sort of mentality. And it has really gone beyond the limit. And I think the Malaysian government itself should be held responsible because it allowed this sort of thinking to develop. And it has penetrated so many other Muslim countries. Whenever I go abroad to some of these Muslim majority countries, I can see how pernicious this, the spread of this poison has become. This whole thing about the Sunni-Shia conflict. So these are the dimensions that have emerged in the mess that we're witnessing in West Asia, which Jeff had also talked about. And I asked myself, what are the lessons, and this is my conclusion, that one can draw from this? For those of us who yearn for change, I would like to argue that we should try to bring about change through nonviolent means. I mean, look at what's happening in Syria, what is happening in Libya. Whenever violence becomes part of the struggle for change, you find that there's a huge price to pay. So try to avoid violence at all costs. We know that the state sometimes is very violent, but even in the face of state violence, I think one should try to develop nonviolent, peaceful methods of change. That is very important. And I give two examples in Muslim history. There are a lot of examples in the case of other countries too, but two examples in the case of Muslim history where nonviolence played a major role in bringing about a major transformation. One is Indonesia. The 1998 overthrow of Suharto, who was a dictator for 32 years. If you look at that change, it was largely nonviolent. It succeeded. And it was against a dictator whose tentacles of power were really very, very strong at one point. And the other example before 1998 is, of course, Iran. The Iranian Revolution itself was very, very peaceful, as many of us know. There were women at the forefront carrying their babies in the revolt in the revolution that took place. Of course, later on things changed. But the revolution itself was nonviolent, which means that nonviolent change can take place. We have to be patient. We have to struggle, we have to sacrifice. People say, well, people get killed, but when there's violence, you also get killed. The point one is making is, I think there is a case for nonviolent change. Standing up against brutal, barbaric forces, but using your spirit, your heart, your mind to try to bring about change. The other point that one wants to make is change has to be driven by forces within a society. You cannot do it from outside, and you should not allow it. You should not allow it. This idea of regime change, of manipulating situations, of pushing your own agenda, I think we, whether Muslims or Christians, Buddhists, Hindus, we should have enough dignity not to allow this to happen, to be used by forces outside. Because every time this has happened, it's a disaster. I ask myself, for instance, look at Libya. Yes, Gaddafi was a dictator. There are terrible things that he did, but he also did many good things for his people, which one can't deny. But whatever it is, the situation today is 1,000 times worse than those years that Gaddafi was in power. There is not even an operating government, a functioning government now in Libya. Now, this is what happens when others come in and manipulate the situation. And here again, you find how a mischievous academic may have had a role in the case of Libya, the French philosopher, Bernard Levy. He's the one who apparently telephoned Sarkozy, who was president at that time, and told him, look, the best thing you can do is to invade Libya, support a NATO invasion. And Sarkozy listened to this man. Sometimes people make that mistake of listening to academics. And this is what happens, right? So here again, disaster. But the point one is making is change has to be driven by internal forces, not by forces outside a particular situation. Yet another point that I would like to make is that when we analyze these forces at work, what you cannot ignore are the economic dimensions. Very often we tend to ignore that. I think a lot of what is happening, not only in West Asia, but in other parts of the world, they're actually linked to certain developments and trends in the global economy. If you look at Ukraine, the economic factors are very clear. Even if you look at West Asia, even if you look at what has been happening in Syria and what has been happening in Libya, they are linked to gas lines, and they are linked to attempts to perhaps sidestep Turkey in one instance or Qatar in another instance, or to sidestep Russia as far as the supply of gas is concerned, of energy. All these factors are at work. So it's really very complex, very, very complex. And we must not lose sight of that complexity whenever we talk about geopolitics. There's geoeconomics at work too, and that has a very big impact. And finally, as far as this particular argument is concerned, the responsibility of people in a particular situation, since we're talking about Muslims here and Muslim extremism, I think Muslims also will have to be much more critical about themselves. While we acknowledge all these other forces at work, look at ourselves. That we have allowed a particular Muslim nation to be so dominant when we know it is an exporter of terrorism. It is an exporter of terrorism. In this closed room, we can mention the name of that country. It's Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has played a very big role in exporting terrorism. People dare not speak against Saudi Arabia because they're so afraid of our Hajj quotas. That's the reason. Oh, that's the reason. No, it is real. The Hajj quotas. And otherwise, they will say your quota will be reduced by half this year. And for Muslim governments, this is something which they really fear, that their quotas would be reduced. Or it's because of the money that is available and the way in which they fund various activities, and perhaps Saudi princes and princesses are much more capable than others of giving you expensive gifts. And since you want these expensive gifts, you're prepared to trade your integrity. But I think Saudi Arabia has been a major problem, and we must be willing to say this. And we must be willing to say that we will not collude in any way with the type of ideology that has emerged from IS and from the Jabhat al-Nusra and other such groups, because it is not part of Islam. There's a debate going on in American academic circles now on why Obama did not refer to Islamic terrorism in his White House speech recently. Because he said, you must call this by its correct name. It is Islamic terrorism that we are talking about. It is not Islamic. We know it is not Islamic because it in no way represents Islam. But we must do more than just say that. I think we must take a stand as Muslims against trends and tendencies of this sort. And that means coming to terms with things that are really quite painful. The way in which Islam has been understood, interpreted, the role of the ulama, or at least a huge segment of the contemporary ulama, we must be prepared to take a position against things of that sort. And that requires courage. Thank you very much.